Correction, I'm not a psychologist. I am a social worker. And so my background is in gender-based violence more broadly. I have worked with survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence, and then obviously now around the issue of female genital mutilation and cutting in the US. So I have this clinical background of working directly with survivors and those who have been impacted by violence and trauma. But I also have a lot of experience around systems change work, specifically around violence prevention. And so that's a lot of what we do at the network is we focus more on systems change and policy advocacy and education. And so I think that those two experiences is really unique, and it's also really helpful to have this clinical background in the work to change systems. For me, I think it helps ground me in the work, and knowing why we need to change these systems and the impact of systems on survivors of trauma and violence.
Thank you, Caitlin. And I'll introduce myself as well. My background is in filmmaking, and I accidentally, and I say this with a lot of fun, created an AI-driven app. I've been associated with the movement of FGMC for the last 12 years, seeing the movement grow very, very closely in India. And Caitlin, it would be great fun to swap notes on how it is in the US at the moment and what's happening in India right now. Unfortunately, our Zoom meeting is just for 40 minutes, so we have a long way to cover. So I'm just going to start off. So I think it might be a great idea to set an intention for this talk. Like, what is it that we want our participants to take from this talk? Why this talk? And also understanding what is, FGMC, and what do we mean when we talk about the trauma that survivors endure?
Yeah, that's a lot in one question. And so I think what my hope is for everyone here is to, I think about FGMC in and other forms of gender-based violence in a bigger picture. I think a lot of times when we think about violence and we have conversations about violence, it's very focused on individual experiences. And so I really like to kind of zoom back a little bit and look at these bigger picture, which is why I like to talk and work around systems change a lot. And so I'm hoping that this conversation will help open that up a little bit for you all who are here with us today.
So welcome all once again, and now we are diving into the theme. So I'm going to read the question, Caitlin. What is GBV and what is FGMC? Because a lot of us probably, especially joining us from India, this might be a new information.
Yeah, so gender-based violence is sort of an umbrella term that encompasses any type of violence that is directed at somebody because of the gender, their gender identity. And so this, as I mentioned, is an umbrella term. So it encompasses a lot of different issues. It includes domestic violence. It includes sexual violence. It, of course, includes FGCM. It also includes violence against LGBTQ folks and trans individuals. And it can also include policies that are implemented with the intention of oppressing certain genders. And so it's a very encompassing term. But usually when we talk about gender-based violence, we usually mean topics such as domestic violence, sexual violence, and FGMC.
And we're delving a little bit deeper into the practice of female genital cutting, also known as female genital mutilation. And we're also delving into how a lot of survivors who've undergone the subject feel this hesitation to open up. And that's really the hardest step in the process, to acknowledge that, yes, they are survivors of FGMC and they want to talk about it. What do you think? Where does that hesitation comes from?
Yeah, there is a lot of shame that is associated with all forms of gender-based violence, but especially FGMC. And this shame is created and fostered by a lot of different things, our systems, our communities, our cultures. And that shame can really make it difficult for people to come forward. They may feel like there's something wrong with them, or that they don't fit in. And I also want to add that there are also folks who have experienced FGMC who don't feel shame and who are very proud of experiencing that and being cut. And so I think it's just a great example of how trauma and violence can be experienced in so many different ways. But this shame is definitely consistent in all forms of gender-based violence, and it's intentional, right? Because gender-based violence, including FGMC, is a way to oppress primarily women and girls. That shame exists to keep that oppression in place, right? If we're not shamed by our experiences and we're openly talking about them, then that actually challenges these systems of oppression that holds this violence in place. And so I want to just say that shame is intentional when it comes to these systems of oppression and ensuring that the practice continues to happen. And so I think one of the best tools is sharing our stories, talking about our experiences, and breaking through that shame and really talking about it, which I think is such a great tool that Mumkin has, is to create those conversations and to break through that shame. So I think that's crucial when we're talking about ending FGMC and other forms of gender-based violence.
I think you delved right in when you touched upon shame as the most, the common denominator, if you will. I think the hardest step in India has been for women and girls to come out in the open and acknowledge it to themselves first, that yes, they have survived the practice. And like you mentioned, the experience can be really, really unhomogeneous. It could be for someone, yes, I'm a proud member of the community that practices FGMC, and I know I underwent it and I feel absolutely nothing about it. On the other hand, for someone, it might be so traumatic that that might be the secret that they literally take to their graves. So, and I think while creating Mumkin, we had this, like this whole session where we wanted to showcase as many experiences of the survivor as possible, where there's a literally that umbrella, that spectrum from I don't feel anything to I feel I can't even face my mother anymore. So how does one understand the subject matter at hand, especially when there are so many subjective responses? What has been your sort of like go-to way to speak to people one-on-one when there are so many subjective responses?
Yeah, I think on a one-on-one level, I think it's just important not to go in with any assumptions or your own beliefs about the practice, and just hear from them. How do you feel about it? What is your experience? As a social worker, we're always trained, use the language that they're using. If they're not referring to it as mutilation or cutting or anything else, like using the language that they're using, is and just following their lead, and like I mentioned, not going in with such our own sort of biases or understanding of the practice, but really listening to them and how it has or hasn't impacted them, and validating them. And I think that there can also be an education piece about, we know that FGMC is a human rights violation, right? We know it is a form of gender-based violence, and so you can bring in that education in a empathic way and supportive and validating way, without furthering the shame that they may be experiencing, but just validating, using their language, and meeting them where they're at.
I'm so glad you said this because I think just yesterday we were having this conversation and I was speaking about how in the 12 years of the work that we've done, I've literally learned to parrot the language of the survivor. And I use the word parrot because if the survivor wishes to call it mutilation, we quickly change to mutilation. If the survivor wishes to call it cutting or khatna or circumcision, I think the most important task at hand is to honor the survivor more than anyone else, because, she or they might be the person who needs that validation, like you said. For those of you who've just joined us, I'm in conversation with the director of US and FGMC. We are threadbearing the practice of female genital cutting or mutilation from the perspective of systems change and also understanding trauma and the trauma that the practice can take on survivors. You, in your experience as a social worker, I remember having this conversation with you where you were mentioning how certain types of themes keep emerging when you speak to survivors, and it's almost like a repetitive cycle. Survivors have a way of speaking. Could you maybe shed some light on that?
Yeah, so, and this is part of the reason why I moved to systems change work and more macro social work, as we call it, is, when I was sitting in the counseling room with survivors of trauma and I was, providing that one-on-one counseling, the same sort of themes kept coming up. They kept facing the same type of barriers. Many of them were experiencing racism and sexism and homophobia and xenophobia. They were coming up to barriers with the systems around receiving food stamps or other types of benefits for low income folks here in the US. And these just kept coming up over and over again. And those were really central to what our counseling sessions were about, and were really the underlying issues to a lot of the things that were what was causing them to come to counseling. And so for me as a counselor, that was really frustrating because I felt I didn't have any power. I was having these same conversations, and yes, I can work with these individuals to maybe reduce their anxiety or reduce symptoms of depression, but these same systems that are causing a lot of these issues for them are still going to be in place, right? And so how much can I actually do as an individual? And so that actually is what really triggered for me to say, I need to actually help work on these systems and change these systems. I've always kind of come from a prevention focus, a primary prevention, meaning to stop the violence from happening to begin with, right? We don't want any violence to occur. And so for me coming in with that framework, I'm like, the best way to stop these barriers is to change these systems and actually help ensure that they're working for people and not against them. And so that's why I switched to systems change work and left the counseling and the direct clinical practice. And I feel like I can do more by changing these systems and working on policy change and cultural change, right? And practice change, all of these things that are core to systems change. I feel like that is where at least I have the most impact. Not saying clinical work isn't important, absolutely. But for me and my skills and my interests, I felt much more useful to switch over to these systems change.
That's so fascinating because you mentioned about the food stamps, and you mentioned about just the framework within which we operate. And I think, so just to give everyone a context, those of you who have just joined us and probably hearing about the practice of FGMC for the first time, FGMC happens in India. In fact, it happens in 92 countries across the world. And like Caitlin just mentioned earlier, one of the main reasons that we don't get to hear about it a lot is because it's shrouded in stigma and shame. Imagine having to go through your worst nightmare. Imagine that nightmare happening to a private part of your body. And then imagine having to own it up that, yes, it happened. And then what complicates the matter is what I personally actually call it as, oh my God, the double whammy in the situation that, here's a private practice, a thing which is happening to a woman's private, genitalia. And again, it is happening around a culture which really, really suppresses anything to do with women's body and sexuality. And it's doubly complicated if the community which is practicing it doesn't have a voice in the broader context. So, for example, in the US, we request everyone to be on mute, especially those who have just joined us. Could you please mute your microphones? Thank you. Shreya Das, could you mute your microphone? Thank you. So as I was saying, I think one of the hardest thing is to be then able to navigate Islamophobia, whether it's in India or in the US, and navigate the fear of othering while opening up about, the hardest time, the something that you rather not speak about. How is it in the US? I know in India, it's very, very difficult to open up about such things.
Yeah, very similar in the US as well. In the US, we still very much have this misconception that FGMC doesn't happen here, right? It is very much rooted in racist and Islamophobic beliefs that it only happens over there, right? It only happens in Africa, it only happens in Islam communities. And we know that's not true. We know it happens, as you mentioned, in over 92 countries around the world. It happens in all communities, all religions. FGMC actually predates all religions, right? And so at the network, that's a lot of the work that we are doing, is trying to correct these misconceptions that it does happen here. And it was and still is very medicalized in the US, which means that it's medical providers that are doing the cutting. Here in the US, and it was practiced widely up until the 1970s as a treatment for being a lesbian, a treatment for what was called hysteria, which was just a wide-reaching diagnosis against women that were maybe misbehaving. And so it was a treatment for a lot of mental illnesses and being a lesbian and all sorts of other things in the US. And so we have our own history with it. And even recently, within the past few years, there was a major case of FGMC being done at a medical clinic. And so that has its own long history in and of itself. But because of these misconceptions, that there's still a lot of education to be done. Because if people don't think it happens here, then there's no motivation to help end it, right? And so, and along those lines, with that misconception, for folks who have been impacted by FGMC here in the US or even abroad and have come here, that shame is even more so, right? Because if folks have experienced this, but then are also hearing the message it doesn't happen here, right? That invalidates their experience. And so that's a lot of what we're facing here in the US, is all of these misconceptions and wrong information and education that really just perpetualizes the trauma for folks who have experienced it here in the US.
I'm really surprised. I was caught off guard when you mentioned that even in the US, they believe that it's happening somewhere else. Definitely in India, there's this idea that it's an African ritual and doesn't happen in India. There's always this sort of othering. But even in the US, and that really blows my mind because, there are so many, relatively speaking, organizations that are supporting the movement, that are openly talking about FGMC, also because there's such a culturally, the US is such a culturally rich place. There are people from all over the world, one would assume. So the movement also then gains that kind of international sort of visibility. But I think because we're also talking about the trauma of the survivor, it's such a double whammy again, that she has to not just fight the system, which might be her own parents, her own community members, but she also has to fight for that. Okay, it happens here. How do I get that visibility? How do I get people to know that it happens here? And then again, I think this is something that I personally, I think a lot about it. How do we then once a survivor comes out and shares, and this is irrespective of it being FGCM or any other form of GBV, how do we then get the survivor the kind of validation that she needs externally, and how does one navigate, that coming out of, just sharing your story? What are some of the tools that we can provide a survivor?
Yeah, I mean, validation and empathy to me are number one together. Validating their experience, and really empathizing with them. And I use empathy specifically instead of sympathy, right? Empathy is when we're feeling it with them. Sympathy is I feel sorry for you, right? That we need to actually empathize and validate with them. But again, bringing it back to the systems change, which is where I'm always going back to, the best way that we can support survivors is to change this culture, right? We need a culture that enables survivors to come forward, to speak their truth, to share their experiences, and not be shamed, not be punished, not be ostracized, right? And so the best way that we can support survivors is to change the systems, is to break this culture of silence. To me, that's the best way. Individually, absolutely, the validation, the empathy, parroting their language, as we've talked about, all of these things that we've mentioned already. But I'll reiterate, the best way I think to support survivors is to change the systems, to break the silence, to allow a culture where they can speak their truth and share their experiences, and to prioritize prevention, right? That's the best thing that we can do, is to ensure that this doesn't happen to anybody else. That's the best way to support survivors, right? And so to make sure that there are no other survivors. And so that's my idea of the best way that we can support folks who are coming out or want to come out with their stories.
Thank you for bringing us back to that systems change. And to those of us who have joined us today and are listening about FGMC for the first time, I highly, highly recommend reading up about it. And also, because a lot of you are from India, Caitlin, there's this saying in India, "In mein to aisa hi hota hai," in Hindi, which literally translates into, this happens to those people, it doesn't happen to us. So when you are getting to learn about or know about for the first time a practice which you have absolutely no idea about, or it could be someone sharing their private story about any form of GBV, the first thing that you can do is meet them where they are at, follow, literally parrot their language, use their language, like Caitlin mentioned, empathy, not sympathy, and not to then go back to any kind of cultural stereotypes of, okay, it just happens with them, it's not us. That's like the worst thing you could probably do to a survivor, because she or they or they would have already traveled so far in their heads to come out and share their story. So the best thing probably at that moment is to just listen, and also then to empower them by what Caitlin mentioned, that creating that space. And how do we then create that space systematically? Perhaps each one of us can share this knowledge with the other person they meet, respectfully, in respectful communication. Did you know that I learned about it? But I think, Caitlin, just to throw in the towel and also speak very directly, there's such a lack of funding and there's such a lack of support. I remember in India in 2010, 2015, even we struggled with, bodies like UN for them to recognize that it happens in India, right? So how do we then get the bigger international players to recognize that this also is a grave matter, especially in a country like India, where there's so many other things happening?
Yeah, I mean, education is key. I mean, that's a lot of what we do at the network, is just educating funders, educating, our elected officials, educating anyone that has this sort of power to provide any type of resources for us. And when I say us, I mean the much broader movement, not just the network. And so people need to know that it does happen here, that it is a problem, and they need to know everything that we've just talked about. And because again, if people don't think that it's happening here or don't think that it's a problem, they're not going to prioritize it. And so we need to just continue our work, which is tireless, right? It's exhausting. But we need to keep doing this work to really educate folks and inform them of how severe this is and how widespread of an issue this is and how it does need to be a priority.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a long way to go, but I'm so glad that we've at least begun. And I'm so happy to speak about this. Each time I, talk about FGMC, just within the short span of 10 years that we've been associated with the movement, we have seen change happen on the ground. They say change may take a lifetime, but it really doesn't when enough of us starts to speak out and really speak out with the intention of, like you mentioned, shattering the silence and stigma around it. Thank you so much for those insights, Caitlin. I'm going to open the floor to some questions to make it a little bit more interactive. I'm opening the floor to questions. If you have anything to ask Caitlin or me, please feel free to unmute and yeah, share your thoughts. I'm also going to give a shout out to Renee. Thank you for joining in, Renee. It's really, really nice to see you here. I know it's morning in America. Yeah, thank you for being here. Yeah, I can see someone who's raised their hands. Do you mind unmuting yourself? And
Yeah. Hello. Hello. So, my name is Jashti and I'm the co-founder of Girl Up Couch. We are so glad that we collaborated with Mumkin for this webinar. So, my question is actually to you and not to Elsie. The reason being that I wanted to know more about the legalization of FGMC in India and if there are any laws that prevent it here. Because as we discussed earlier, that there's not much of an awareness that such a practice even exists here in India.
thank you for that question, Drishti. I think law in India is such a rich question that I can probably have a whole meeting about this. You know, in India, it's very complex, right? There is a law of safeguarding religious freedom of the minorities, right? But you know what we've gleaned is that when this movement really started to gain prominence, the movement also started to go underground. Caitlin spoke about how in the US, FGMC is medicalized. In India, however, US Khatna or circumcision as it's known, it is not medicalized and it's still done by midwives. So imagine if there were to be a law in India, there are very, very high chances that the movement would be pushed further underground. So I think the legislation aspect of this is kind of a either or scenario. And I think the way we want to further change is through dialogue within the community and making people aware first before taking the legal route so that it doesn't get banned. We have very little time, unfortunately. I want to say my thank you to Caitlin. Caitlin, there's a time on Zoom, unfortunately. We don't have the pro version, but thank you all for joining. And Caitlin, it was really nice having you on board. If any of you have any pressing questions, please feel free to send it our way. If it's a question to Caitlin, I'll definitely share a contact with you directly. And is there any other question? I don't know. I don't want to run out on time. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you so much.